War rarely announces itself politely. It arrives in thunder, boots on wood floors, engines choking the night air, and the quiet collapse of the ordinary world people once trusted. For the small farming village tucked between low hills and winter fields, the war had felt distant for years. Newspapers spoke of battles across oceans and borders, but the villagers still woke before sunrise, still harvested wheat, still sent children down dusty roads to school. Life had continued, until the trucks came. They arrived just after dusk, when the last light of the sun faded into a pale red line across the horizon. At first, people thought they were supply vehicles passing through. Soldiers had traveled this road before. Some bought bread. Others traded cigarettes for milk. But this convoy did not stop in the center of town. It stopped at the houses. Doors were forced open. Lanterns fell to the ground. Voices shouted in a language the villagers barely understood, though the tone required no translation. Fear spread quickly in places where there was nowhere to run. Inside one small wooden house at the edge of the village lived a woman named Eliza and her daughter, Anna. The house was old but warm, built by Eliza's husband years earlier before the war carried him away to a distant front. 4 months, mother and daughter had survived alone. Eliza kept the farm running, waking before dawn to tend chickens and repair fences that winter storms knocked down. Anna, only 12 years old, helped wherever she could, feeding animals, gathering firewood, and trying to pretend that the silence left by her father's absence wasn't growing heavier every day. That night, Anna was sitting by the stove reading from a worn book when the first truck engine echoed through the valley. Eliza looked up instantly. Something about the sound was wrong. Convoys usually passed along the main road. These engines were turning off it, turning toward the houses. Anna heard it too. She closed the book slowly. "Are they stopping here?" she asked quietly. Eliza didn't answer right away. She moved to the window and lifted the curtain just enough to see the road. Headlights cut across the darkness like blades. And then she saw soldiers climbing down from the trucks. Too many. Her stomach tightened. "Anna," she said calmly, though her voice carried the weight of something far heavier than calm. "Yes. Come here." Anna walked across the small room. Eliza knelt beside her and placed both hands gently on her shoulders. In that moment, the mother realized something that would stay with her forever. The war had finally reached their door. Outside, boots struck the frozen ground. Doors slammed. Voices shouted commands across the village. One house down the road, a woman screamed. Anna's eyes widened. "Eliza, what's happening?" Eliza didn't answer the question directly. Instead, she did something mothers have done for centuries in moments of sudden danger. She started making decisions faster than fear could keep up. She took Anna by the hand and led her toward the back of the house. Behind a stack of grain sacks was a narrow wooden hatch leading to a small storage cellar. It was little more than a hole beneath the floorboards, used to store potatoes and winter vegetables. Anna had played there when she was younger. Tonight it would become a hiding place. "Listen to me very carefully," Eliza whispered. Anna's breathing had already begun to quicken. "Why are we going down there?" "Because I need you to stay quiet," Eliza said gently. "No matter what you hear." Anna looked confused. Outside, another scream echoed through the night. This time closer. Eliza opened the hatch. The cellar smelled of dirt and old wood. "Climb down." Anna hesitated. "Are you coming too?" Eliza paused. And in that single pause, a mother's entire future collapsed into a single impossible choice. "I will soon," she said softly. Anna believed her. Children often do. She climbed down the ladder slowly, disappearing into the darkness beneath the house. Eliza closed the hatch halfway but left a small gap so her daughter could breathe. Then she stood up. Outside, footsteps were approaching their door. And Eliza understood something with terrifying clarity. If the soldiers searched the house, they would find Anna. Unless someone made sure they didn't. The knock never came. The door burst open. 3 soldiers stepped inside, their boots carrying mud and snow across the wooden floor. They looked around quickly, scanning the room. Eliza stood alone beside the stove. One soldier said something to the others and pointed toward the back rooms. Another walked toward her. He spoke in broken words she barely understood, but the meaning was clear enough. They were not here for supplies. They were here because war had stripped away the rules that once protected ordinary people. For a moment, Eliza's eyes moved toward the grain sacks covering the cellar hatch. Anna was directly beneath them. Silent. Hidden. Still safe. The soldier stepped closer. "Anyone else here?" he asked roughly. Eliza shook her head. "No." He studied her face. The room grew quiet. And then, in a moment that would decide everything, Eliza did something unexpected. She stepped toward the door. "I'll come with you," she said. The soldiers exchanged confused looks. One laughed. But Eliza didn't laugh. She simply walked outside into the cold night air. Behind her, the small house fell silent again. And beneath the floorboards, Anna waited in darkness, clutching her book, wondering why her mother hadn't come down yet. She would not understand the truth until many years later. But the choice had already been made. A mother had walked out alone. And because of that choice, her daughter would live. The night grew colder after Eliza stepped outside. A thin wind moved through the empty fields surrounding the village, carrying the distant sound of trucks idling along the narrow dirt road. Lanterns swung from the sides of the vehicles, throwing restless shadows across fences and barns that had stood peacefully for decades before war ever touched them. Now every shadow looked like danger. Eliza closed the door behind her carefully. For a brief moment she rested her hand on the wooden frame of the house. It was the same doorway her husband had built with his own hands years earlier, when the world had still felt predictable. She did not look back. She might have hesitated. And hesitation could destroy everything. The soldiers waiting outside seemed surprised when she walked toward them willingly. They had expected resistance, fear, pleading, anything but a quiet step forward. One of them spoke to the others in a low voice, and another gestured down the road. Eliza understood what they wanted: control and intimidation. But she also understood something far more important. As long as they focused on her, they would not return inside the house. Inside that house, beneath the wooden floorboards, her daughter remained hidden in the small cellar. Anna sat there in darkness, hugging her knees. At first she believed her mother would come down after locking the door. That was what mothers did during storms or emergencies. They gathered their children close and waited together until danger passed. But minutes went by. Then more minutes. Anna heard voices above her through the thin floorboards. Boots moved across the room. A chair scraped along the floor. Then the door opened again. Cold air rushed through the cracks in the boards above her head. She heard her mother's voice outside, faint and carried by the wind. Anna could not understand the words clearly. She only knew one thing. Her mother was not coming down into the cellar. Not yet. Anna pressed her hand over her mouth to keep herself from calling out. Her heart beat so loudly she feared someone above might hear it. The cellar smelled of earth and potatoes. Dust floated in the faint beam of moonlight slipping through a crack near the hatch. She stayed very still. Upstairs, the soldiers moved around the house for several minutes. One opened cupboards. Another walked through the small bedroom. But eventually they lost interest. The house seemed empty. Because the one person they had seen had already walked outside to meet them. Eliza. Outside the house, the soldiers led her toward the center of the village. Other homes stood dark and silent, though faint lights flickered behind a few curtains where families waited in fear. No one stepped outside. At the far end of the road, several trucks were parked near the village square. A handful of soldiers stood around them smoking cigarettes and talking quietly. Eliza was pushed forward into the lantern light. The officer beside the first truck looked up and studied her with the cold curiosity of someone who had been at war too long. "From the house?" he asked one of the soldiers. The soldier nodded. The officer's eyes moved past Eliza, scanning the dark road behind her as if expecting others to follow. But no one did. Just a woman. Alone. Exactly as she intended. Back in the cellar, Anna waited. Time stretched strangely in the darkness. Without light or movement, it became impossible to measure how long she had been sitting there. She listened carefully. At first she heard distant voices. Then engines starting and stopping. Then silence. Every creak in the wood above her sounded like footsteps. Several times Anna nearly climbed the ladder to look. But she remembered what her mother had said. Stay quiet. No matter what you hear. So she stayed. Hours passed. Eventually the village grew still again. One by one the truck engines faded into the distance as the convoy left the valley and disappeared down the road. The soldiers were gone. But Anna did not know that. She remained hidden beneath the floorboards long after the last engine sound vanished. Above her, the house sat quietly under the pale moonlight. A chair still lay tipped over near the stove. A cupboard door hung half open. The front door had been left slightly ajar. Cold air drifted slowly through the room. But there were no soldiers. And no Eliza. Far down the road, the trucks continued driving toward the next town. Inside one of them sat Eliza. Her hands were tied loosely, but she did not struggle. She stared out at the passing fields illuminated briefly by the headlights. Familiar land moved by in darkness. Farms and barns where families once lived peacefully. She wondered if she would ever see her daughter again. But even as the thought came, she pushed it away. The decision had already been made. If the soldiers believed she lived alone, they would not return to search the house again. They would not discover the cellar. They would not find Anna. It was a simple plan born in a moment of absolute terror. Back in the village, faint gray light appeared along the horizon as dawn slowly approached. Anna noticed it first through the crack near the cellar hatch. Morning. Her legs were stiff from sitting so long. Carefully, she climbed the ladder and pushed the hatch open. The house looked empty. She stepped into the kitchen quietly. "Mama?" she called softly. No answer. The stove had gone cold. The door stood open. Anna walked outside. The village looked different in the early morning light. Several houses had broken windows. Footprints covered the snow in the road. Neighbors stood outside speaking in hushed voices. One woman noticed Anna first. Her face changed immediately and she hurried across the road. "Anna," she said gently. "Where is my mother?" Anna asked. The woman did not answer right away. Instead, she wrapped her arms around the girl and held her tightly. Sometimes adults know truths children are not ready to hear. But Anna was already beginning to understand something had changed forever. The trucks were gone. The soldiers had disappeared. And her mother had walked out into the night and never returned. Years would pass before Anna fully understood what happened that night. Years before she realized the terrible courage behind a single quiet decision. Her mother had stepped outside alone. Not because she was powerless, but because she was protecting the one life she loved more than her own. War does not always end when the guns fall silent. Sometimes it lingers quietly in the lives of those who survived. Hidden in memories, in empty chairs at dinner tables, in the long spaces where someone's voice used to be. For Anna, the war ended on a cold morning in that small village. But its shadow followed her for the rest of her life. When the first light of dawn spread across the valley that morning, the village looked strangely peaceful. Snow rested quietly on rooftops, and smoke rose slowly from chimneys where families had begun lighting their stoves again. But the villagers knew something had changed. Doors hung open where soldiers had forced their way inside. Footprints covered the frozen ground. Windows were shattered in two houses near the square. And in front of one small wooden home, a young girl stood barefoot in the snow, looking down the road where the trucks had disappeared hours earlier. Anna did not cry at first. She simply watched the empty road. Somewhere deep inside her, a quiet understanding had already begun to form. Not the full truth, but the sense that something important had been taken from her. Neighbors slowly gathered around her. The woman who had first rushed across the road wrapped a coat around Anna's shoulders while another man closed the door of the house behind them to keep the cold wind out. But Anna barely noticed. Her eyes remained fixed on the road. "Maybe she went with them," she said quietly. The woman beside her nodded gently. "Yes," she said softly. But her voice carried uncertainty. Because in war, when someone disappears into the night with soldiers, the future becomes a question that may never receive an answer. In the days that followed, the villagers searched everywhere they could. They walked along the road where the convoy had traveled and spoke with nearby towns that had seen the trucks passing through. But the war had swallowed thousands of people by that point. One more missing name disappeared into its chaos. Eventually the search stopped. The village returned to its routines again, though nothing truly felt the same. Anna moved into the home of the neighbor who had comforted her that morning. The woman promised to care for her as if she were family. And she did. Years passed. The war finally ended. Soldiers returned home. Cities were rebuilt. Nations tried to move forward. But in that small valley village, one story remained quietly remembered. The story of a mother who walked out alone. Anna grew older. The frightened 12-year-old who once hid beneath the floorboards slowly became a young woman. She continued helping on the farm and learning how to live in a world that had changed far too quickly. For a long time she avoided thinking about that night. The memory of the cellar, the voices above her, and the sound of trucks in the darkness felt like fragments from a nightmare she could not fully understand. But time has a way of revealing truths. One winter evening, nearly 10 years after the war ended, Anna finally asked the question she had carried for years. She sat beside the stove with the woman who had taken her in. "Marta," she said quietly. The older woman looked up from her knitting. "Yes." Anna hesitated. "Why did my mother go outside that night?" Marta stopped knitting. For a moment, the room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. It was a question she had always known would come. "You remember hiding in the cellar?" she asked gently. Anna nodded. "My mother told me to stay quiet." Marta took a slow breath. "She knew the soldiers would search the house," she said. Anna listened carefully. "And if they found you?" The sentence stopped there. It didn't need to be finished. Understanding spread slowly across Anna's face. Her mother had not simply walked outside. She had stepped into danger intentionally, not because she was weak, but because someone had to redirect the soldiers' attention away from the house, away from the cellar, away from Anna. For a long moment Anna said nothing. Then she looked down at her hands. "She saved me," she whispered. Marta nodded quietly. Yes. That realization changed something inside Anna. For years she had wondered why her mother left. Now she understood the truth. Her mother had not abandoned her. She had protected her. The choice Eliza made that night was not an act of surrender. It was an act of courage so quiet that almost no one outside that village would ever know it happened. No medals were awarded. No history books recorded the moment. But in the life Anna lived afterward, in every year she survived and every future she built, the meaning of that choice remained. A mother had stepped forward so her child could remain hidden. As Anna grew older, she carried that story with her. She eventually married and started a family of her own. When her first daughter was born, she gave the child the name Eliza. Not because she wanted to remember the war, but because she wanted to remember the courage that lived inside one ordinary woman. Years later, when Anna's children were old enough, she told them the story. Not the darkest parts. Only the most important truth. "Your grandmother was brave," she said. "She made a choice that saved my life." The children listened quietly. Outside their window, the valley looked peaceful again. Farms had been rebuilt and new houses stood where old ones had once been damaged by war. Life had returned. But some sacrifices remained woven quietly into the foundations of that peace. Because the greatest acts of courage do not always happen on battlefields. Sometimes they happen in small homes at the edge of forgotten villages. Sometimes they happen in the brief moment between a knock on the door and the decision to step outside. And sometimes they happen when a mother walks out alone, so her daughter can live. The world may never know Eliza's full story, but her daughter did. And because Anna lived, the courage of that single decision would never truly disappear, even long after the war itself had faded into the past.